Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. Well, Paul, Chinese decoupling is underway. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this discussion. And there are a number of different places and factors that China is disconnecting from the West.
Yeah, well, glad you've joined me as well today, Ken. Pleasure as ever. And yeah, there was always this idea that was permeating from people in the West who don't understand China at all, that China would have to buckle very quickly under the weight of tariffs because A, they needed to continue to export to the United States, which they don't. They could stop exporting tomorrow and it wouldn't be a problem for China in any way, shape, or form. Yes, it might knock, a third of a percent of its GDP, but so what? China doesn't care. But without Chinese goods, the United States would rapidly fall into an inflationary depression with enormous unemployment. And then this scramble to try and get hold of goods, which is going to be practically impossible to fill the gap. And conversely, there was this idea, well, China can't afford to put tariffs on US exports to China because there was this ridiculous belief that without the United States, China collapses. So China desperately needs US exports. It doesn't. But China put the rates up deliberately to a level that makes practically all US exports to China economically unviable. If it gets to the point, it's pointless trying because nobody's going to buy the goods at those prices. And that was this very tactical, clinical way the Chinese operate. So that's the starting point. But then not only did China do that, but they went, well, okay, if that's your perspective, the United States, well, we're going to actually go through a decoupling process. And they started off initially and gave some warning about rare earths, but then subsequently also then targeting specific US companies in the defense sector and in technology and refusing, putting them on kind of export lists where they would no longer be allowed to export to these companies, which means they're going to hamstring the United States, specifically targeting companies they know that will cause huge problems for the companies, but also cause immense damage to the US economy in the process. And then, of course, they've just carried on relentlessly because, as China said, we don't want a war, but if you want an economic financial war, we'll fight it to the end. And the end isn't the capitulation of China. The end is the capitulation of the United States. And then we heard, of course, the situation where the US backtracked and went, well, when we look at things to do with technology, we're going to have a moratorium on imposing tariffs on them, probably because somebody actually pointed out to the Trump administration that the US is dependent on China for many electrical goods. And just as a small example of this, if you look at things like game consoles, China's share of exports to the United States is 86-87%. PC monitors is about 80%. Smartphones over 70%. Laptops about 68%. Toys for children about 76%. The list goes on and on. And of course, there's computer parts and plastic products. And the United States is heavily dependent on China for these goods. So they panicked and went, hang on, we're going to have to think twice about this. It included semiconductors as well and other electronics equipment, which is often utilized in the United States as, as something that then is put into other industrial applications. So it could be circuit boards, for example. And then, of course, there was all these contradictory statements and somehow, we're going to still put these tariffs on later. But the United States was panicking and backtracking. And then China didn't say, well, we can carry on. we can make your life very, very difficult. But I'll stop there, Ken, so you can come in, and then I'll go and we can start to talk about some of the other policy decisions they made for decoupling.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating because when you saw the response from Beijing to the initial tariffs that were put in from Trump, it was almost like they were doing it as a joke, as if we could boost tariffs to 1,000%, and it doesn't matter. Because in reality, the tariff game with China is not what's important. I saw recently a chart going showing 2000 and 2024. On the left side in 2000, the United States was the primary trader with about 60 to 65% of the world. By 2024, China had surpassed that to 75% of the world uses China as their primary trader. So this more than anything shows the fact that China does not have to rely upon the United States as a trade partner of major significance, especially at the level that the Trump administration thinks that China is relying upon them. We saw this, we did the podcast of the where Xi is going around to other East Asia, the ASEAN nation leaders and improving the trade potential there. They have pretty much most, if not all, of Africa. So it's very easy for China in a short period of time to be able to divert their trade to other nations and bypass the United States altogether. And we're quickly seeing that in the types of goods and resources that are being traded. I know you have a number, but I want to take about one. China is phasing out Western aircraft. They canceled their orders with Boeing, and they're selling them at a Shanghai auction. And they're going to be replaced domestically by Chinese jets. It's the same equivalent of what happened when the United States started cutting them off from high-end GPUs and chips, and China just instead started creating their own chips. And now they're creating technology, Huawei phones, etc., that are either equal to or surpassing what the United States manufactures themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that auction in Shanghai was to sell the China Southern Airlines entire fleet of Boeing 787s, 788s. There was 10 jets and 2 engines. And they will be replaced, you're right, Ken, with domestically made Chinese jets. It's also worth noting China ordered the airlines not to take any further deliveries of Boeing jets. And Beijing also asked Chinese carriers to hold any purchases of aircraft-related equipment and parts from US companies. Now, this, apart from anything else, came about because China unveiled this retaliatory tariffs of 125% on US goods. That alone would have more than doubled the cost of US-made aircraft and parts. Therefore, on that basis, Chinese airlines are going to go, well, we're not accepting these. It's too expensive. So that's the end of our business arrangement with you until this tariff war's over. But in the process, the Chinese government said, well, you're not going to purchase them anyway. And they went, fine, well, we weren't going to, but we don't have a problem with that. The other thing, of course, the Chinese government's also considering ways to provide assistance to airlines that lease Boeing jets and are facing higher costs. Now, the argument is, why is China doing this? It's doing this to hurt these companies, to make these companies go to the Trump administration and go, and I'm going to be polite about this, what the hell are you doing? You are damaging our business irreparably, because once China decides to ditch Boeing, and it goes on for any length of time, then Boeing's ability to get into the Chinese market is going to be enormously restricted. So that's why they're targeting companies this way, because they know full well that that is the way to hurt the United States far more than just blanket tariffs. If you target specific companies, then they're going to go complaining to the government. And if this happens with multiple companies and trade and commerce has an enormous influence in the United States, then they're going to have big problems. And that's why We also look at rare earths, and the United States was under this illusion that somehow they could replace China's rare earths, and someone then pointed out to them, well, you can try and steal Greenland, but it'll take you a decade or more, assuming there is any rare earths there in the first place, to have them economically viable. And then, well, we'll take Ukraine, and the same problem exists. Excuse me. And when you look at rare earths, they're in defense, they're everywhere: cars, phones, industrial applications. And China has 95% of the world's refining capacity. And it's going, we're not going to export it to the United States anymore. We're going to look at every case specifically, just to make sure there isn't some loophole backdoor to get the United States to be able to still be in receipt of them. And then people in the United States started to go, well, we'll just refine our own. What's the problem? Well, A, you need to get hold of the rare earths in the first place. And B, to put refineries in place could take a decade. Might not take exactly a decade, but it's going to take an awful long time. I mean, the argument is, for the time being, companies in the United States probably have enough inventory to last, being generous, maybe 6 months. Now, if this carries on and China doesn't reverse this policy, then within 6 months or so, you're going to start to have enormous problems. So you have the rare earths, and then there's magnets, and then you've got the semiconductor industries and auto industries. This is a huge problem. And the United States didn't think any of this through. They didn't think for 1 minute that China would be targeting things in such a way, and being very specific in who they were targeting and how they were targeting them. You know, and if you've got a nation that produces 90% of some of the most critical rare earth minerals, and you're stopping the exports to the United States, well, you're going to have a huge problem. And somebody should have pointed this out to the Trump administration and gone, look, it's very obvious you're going to have huge problems. And, you know, therefore, why are you deciding to, you know, go to war with the Chinese? You're having a gunfight and you're carrying a knife. You know, you can't win in this regard. I think to some extent, there's elements inside the United States who are beginning to realize this, but the damage is already done. And China's already, of course, made this point where they've practically ended oil imports from the United States. Instead, they've gone to Canada, of all places, almost like to just rub the United States' nose in it. They've also looking at having no LNG supplies from China to the United States. And we know that the Chinese can also hurt the United States in ways like dumping US treasuries, dumping US assets, putting a squeeze on US companies inside China in terms of the US imports into China, because they've made it practically impossible for anyone to do so. And I can tell people without fear of contradiction, the amount of people we've had privately getting in touch who have small businesses in the United States, and they're already in big trouble. I mean, I was speaking to someone today who obviously their major export market's the US, and they're having to mothball operations because it's economically unviable for them to export to the United States. And this is not Chinese, by the way. These are people who live in other countries and other territories. So the impact is huge, and it's going to have a detrimental effect on people who export to the United States. It's going to have a detrimental effect on those who are in receipt of those exports or no longer will be. So the other thing that's come out recently is the fact that the revenue they're making from tariffs is basically a fraction of what they claimed it was. I think there was a figure given of 500 billion in 15 days. And what's the price for that? Well, wrecking the US economy, destroying businesses. It's done nothing to address the interest rate problem with regards to US treasuries. The dollar remains weak when it was supposed to be strong. You can argue who cares about equity markets? Well, there's trillions wiped off the value of companies. And we've talked about the risks to companies previously because they need endless credit, and that makes them more of a credit risk. So when you stack all this up, the US has gained absolutely nothing from doing this. And in the process, they've suffered enormously. And they will continue to do so. And China will continue to turn the screw because they can. And they'll just target sector after sector, company after company. And then they have the financial wherewithal to cause the United States huge problems. But then perhaps the real sort of killer moment for the United States is, what is this doing to the dollar? And we'll talk about the dollar in another podcast. But I want to make one point. In the process of doing all this, all the United States is doing is pushing more and more of the world to go, we can't trust the United States. We can trust China. We want to work with China. Do you know what? We'll work with China and we'll trade in the yuan, not the dollar. They are actually, in a sense, causing their own demise because they thought, as I said, they could go in a gunfight with a knife with China, and it's doomed and it's failed. And now they have enormous problems. And what's the only way of dealing with it? They're going to have to walk away from this. They're going to have to make a deal with China. But China's not going to be in any mood to tolerate being bullied and coerced by the United States. It has to be a deal that it works for both parties, is win-win cooperation. And the US is incapable, as things stand, to be able to implement any policy decisions that will last, and is on the basis of we can all win and we can, if we cooperate. When did the United States last do that? I'm struggling to remember. So it's a massive cultural shift in mindset, and it remains to be seen if the US is even capable of doing that.
You know, a couple of things I want to touch upon here. One, I think one of the underlying points that is really missed in all of this is that China understands the United States. Oh, sorry there, cough button. China understands the United States, but the United States does not understand China. And because of that, China is able to react and respond in a very pragmatic way that does affect and hurt the U.S. much more than the U.S. by just willy-nilly throwing tariffs. You know, let me give you an example. There are plenty of rare earths in the United States. And the U.S. government, federal lands, there's still 30% of the entire country is federal lands that the government could do what they see fit upon. The states of Utah, Nevada, and Colorado in 2024, they rediscovered a lot of these rare earths that the U.S. was getting from China. But China is the refiner of the world of rare earths. 90% of the refining is done in China. So for the United States, which has not built a oil refinery in over 40 years for energy, they because of their regulatory system, because of the lack of capital pointed towards infrastructure and reliable energy, it is going to be nearly impossible for the U.S. to try to gear up to suddenly be able to refine any of the rare earths that they may have either domestically or they might get internationally. So China understands this. You know, obviously there have been a number of different American companies that have been in China going back, say, to 1996 and NAFTA, and they understand the corporate, they understand the governmental, they understand the U.S. mindset, they understand their needs, they understand their wants, etc. But as we know, just across the board, the U.S. officials, U.S. analysts, U.S. intellectuals have no understanding of China. And China doesn't have that regulatory constriction or that bureaucracy. If they want something done, they provide the resources. They say, let's do this, and it gets done. And I think that's what, for a great example is the aircraft. If Beijing tells South China Airlines to go ahead and stop using Boeing aircraft and get rid of them, the airline's going to look at Beijing and say, okay, what are you going to provide to us to replace it? And Beijing's going to say, we're replacing it with this. Okay, everything is done. No red tape. It's done. And it gets accomplished. Instead, in the United States, if they want something done, they either have to force countries to try to go against their current mode and mindset. And even then, it's going to be a fight and a struggle. And we have court systems. And what should take months, if not weeks, ends up taking 10 years. And so the United States is completely eradicated in that capacity to be able to switch to a manufacturing, to a productive mindset. The last thing I want to take a look at is the fact that the U.S. Is not wanting to be a partner into the world. They're still in this mindset of hegemonic dominion. And because of this, one of the more important things in regards to growth and trade is capital investment from foreign entities. And the U.S., through these tariffs, through these demands, they are not going to get nations to want to invest in the United States while China is opening the door to capital investment and foreign investment. And with that being said, inevitably, who's going to win? Obviously, it's going to be China. And who's going to win? Those who participate in China's growth and prosperity.
Absolutely. That's, I think, probably a good point to stop, Ken.
Yep. Paul, as always, thank you for your insight and for being a part of this discussion.
Yeah, likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send this out to anybody you think it might be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.